Now, Isaac Vetter is going to tell us how to work with CDS hooks, best practices. Thank you very much. The stage is yours.
Yeah. Morning, everybody. So I know we're competing against the EHDS Birds of a Feather session, so thank you for being here and giving me this time to talk to you about CDS hooks. Again, my name's Isaac Vetter. I work for Epic on tools and standards that help developers build apps. So I hold a couple of elected positions within HL7. And then notably for this session, along with Bryn Rhodes, Bryn is right back there, and Vadim, who is in the EHDS session, lead the CDS hooks project and are primarily responsible for the specification. So what is CDS hooks? So it's a CDS hooks. CDS stands for Clinical Decision Support. It's a real-time, clinician-facing, remote decision support API. So it's a really simple API, kind of a JSON RESTful API using FHIR as the clinical data model. And we define standardized clinical workflow via a library of hooks. This I'm not actually going to give you any more introduction to CDS hooks. So if you don't know, if that's kind of a new term or new idea to you, love to come talk to me, talk to Bryn, talk to other folks who are in this room and experts, and/or here's this YouTube video that does kind of a decent job giving a kind of an introductory overview and big picture of what CDS hooks is. It is recorded in a US setting, but it is also entirely applicable. Notably, CDS hooks is a universal realm specification within HL7 and is deployed in many countries. Okay, rather than doing that introduction, my goal is to give you a brief update on some of the upcoming work of the project as well as recent accomplishments. Although I want to spend a majority of our time on some of the lessons that we as a community have learned from some pioneering CDS hooks implementations. So as implementers and health systems kind of stress test CDS hooks, we're finding some of the gaps and needs that benefit from focus by us as a community. The HL7 Clinical Decision Support Working Group has been collecting and documenting these best practices over the past few quarters. And notably, these are kind of implementation best practices for CDS hooks. Best practices for CDS generally is a really active area of significant research and has been for more than 2 decades. So that's not exactly what this is, right? A quick aside, I pulled together this list of some of the most impactful research around CDS, electronic CDS best practices, and was actually quite impressed by the number of former and current HL7 CDS co-chairs who are actually authors of some of this academic research. So shout out to Ken Kawamoto, Robert Genders, Howard, and even Bryn there in the back for some of this research, contributing to the science of effective CDS. Okay, so upcoming for CDS. So we've been holding Connectathon tracks for the past year and a half, and including intend to hold one in September. That's in Pittsburgh in the US. A big focus of some of our recent Connectathon tracks has been on testing some new advanced features that enable enhanced prefetch functionality towards our goal of kind of enabling improved performance of CDS hooks integrations. So join us in Pittsburgh for our CDS hooks next CDS hooks Connectathon. Over the past quarter and during the next quarter or two, as a project, we're going to be focused on just fixing outstanding reported issues, just the standard HL7 JIRA processes, which will then lead into a CDS hooks STU3, a version 3 of the specification. And my goal is that part of that spec will actually be normative, so in order to kind of communicate stability and maturity to the implementer community. As part of that evaluation, we do need to know which specific features of CDS hooks have seen the most adoption so that we can accurately label maturity levels to those features and to individual hooks. So please do share your implementation experience, chat.phir.org, CDS hook stream. So some recent accomplishments, yeah. So recent accomplishments, things that are mostly done. So here's what the CDS hook spec looked like last year, and then here's what it looks like this year. This seems like this is a small thing. It's formatting. It's not. We didn't actually do substantive changes to the spec on purpose. Rather, we actually just finally adopted the standard, what you'd expect us to have done, typical IG publishing infrastructure. So notably, CDS hooks is now actually 2 interrelated FHIR implementation guides. So there's the base spec, the base CDS hook spec, and then a implementation guide that defines the hook library. So our goal and intent and hope here is that over time, hooks are added and matured independently of the library, of the base spec, and that happens forever. As medicine and the deployment of healthcare continues to advance and mature, there's new workflows get created. We define new hooks that correspond to those workflows, and then those hooks get adopted and matured via our kind of standard and quantitative maturity definitions and processes, and that happens forever. Whereas we want to get to the point with the base CDS hook spec where it's stable, it's reliable, and implementers can adopt and use that with the hooks that they do support. Also, personally, I'm actually proud of the way that we kind of interrelated these 2 IGs. I think it's kind of novel from the FHIR community perspective for the way that we've kind of tied these together from like a spec reader perspective. Would love feedback on that. We've also made some recent enhancements over the last year and a half. Has been a big focus. We've made enhancements to the kind of public and open source CDS hook sandbox. I actually went back and looked at the GitHub commit history, and the sandbox, sandbox.cds-hooks.org, is now actually 10 years old. So the first commit was by Josh Mandel in September 2015. And so for the last decade, as a project, we've been supporting and offering this kind of really easy and convenient and friendly way to onboard new implementers to the CDS hooks project, and which I think is a really important ability and offering. And I'm glad to see that HL7, via their Foundry project, is kind of finally following suit. Okay, finally, we're going to talk about best practices. There's a lot of other stuff that I wanted to talk about too. Okay, so we've defined, so the CDS workgroups publish these best practices. It's on the HL7 Confluence page. We divide them into kind of 3 categories based upon their audience. So we talk about best practices for CDS hooks service developers. That's the kind of API that a health system, EHR can call. And then service developers. So 2, in the spec, we use the term CDS hooks client, because like technically from a server client perspective, they're calling the API. And when you hear CDS client, think EHR. That's the most common use case. So we define best practices for EHR developers, and we're still kind of in the process of gathering those. And then thirdly, we define best practices for health systems, or kind of the IT or end users who are configuring or enabling CDS hooks integrations to be used in clinical practices. So I'm going to walk through each of those different audiences. And across all of those different audiences is the kind of common guidance that CDS services need to be fast. And maybe that sounds obvious, or that sounds trivial, but it's really not. So CDS hooks is a simple synchronous exchange. So it enables this external service to inject content, usually clinical content, into a clinical workflow. Clinical user experience is the most important thing. So with CDS hooks, these external CDS services are now also responsible for that clinical UX. So with that great power also comes great responsibility. And so the overwhelming lesson from the implementation experience that we've had so far is that you can't overestimate the importance of speed. So, and that's regardless of, guidelines. CDS guidelines are complex. It takes time to calculate through them. You're accessing various data stores, sometimes really big data stores. The FHIR server you're interacting with might be slow. Regardless of all of those real-world considerations, the overall poor clinical user experience may halt a CDS hooks integration. We have some really specific guidance from those implementation experiences about like tips and tricks or ways in which you can use just kind of standard FHIR, standard CDS hooks to help optimize the performance of your CDS service. Things like using _include and rev include as part of prefetch queries to minimize the number of queries that you're making. Using date-based searching parameters in order to wherever possible, restrict the data that you're retrieving as part of the exchange to just the data that your CDS algorithm needs in order to run and produce guidance, as well as a lot of other similar things like that. We also obviously are continuing to kind of collect and solicit this type of best practices. And I just had this conversation with Duodecim right there about their experience and best practices. So like we want these best practices to be a resource kind of for the entire community that helps the success and growth of the standard and of the project and of clinical user experience globally. So contribute, join. Okay, another kind of overall theme of guidance of best practices to CDS developers is to target FHIR and CDS hooks capabilities that are available in production. I think hook maturity. So I'm really proud of the hook maturity model that's documented, that's defined as part of the specification, the base CDS hook specification, that kind of follows along similarly to a FHIR maturity model. I think it is a real quantitative indication of hook availability and maturity in the real world. So that gives you a good clue as to the availability of hooks that you'll see in production. Also, test data in test environments and sandboxes, it's imperfect. And again, maybe that's something that sounds obvious, but reality, real data is inconvenient and can be messy. Inpatient stays long-term inpatient stays have a lot of data, have a lot of FHIR observations. Observation is a pretty coarse concept, and never retrieve all observations as part of a CDS hooks integration. You got to really target your queries. Small pilots, small production pilots can really provide important experience that you can use to iterate to make your CDS service kind of more functional and a better clinical user experience. Similarly, also consider maybe silent alerts, or where you kind of deploy your CDS but don't actually show anything for a month, for 3 months, whatever it is, and then you turn around and analyze the data. I think that's also a really common successful practice for the deployment of remote but also local CDS. For CDS clients, such as EHRs, use prefetch, support prefetch, support FHIR $last N in order to enable services to just get that data that they need and not more. Integrates your CDS hooks implementation with your local rule engine functionality, such that local rules can be combined with remote rules in order to call that external API when it provides the most value. And then integrate hooks into real-world workflows. Don't create distinct workflows just for CDS hooks. For health systems, for the end users, including IT teams of a CDS hooks integration. In my experience, many or even most health systems have some kind of CDS governance council or processes that do a quantitative evaluation of a health system's CDS really substantively improves clinical user experience and clinical outcomes. I think you can look to the academic research for that. If non-interruptive alerts can be supported by the clinical workflow that you're targeting by your EHR software, then you should really try to use them. And actionable feedback with minimal clicks is the goal. And then generally kind of follow the 5 rights of CDS. I think those foundational principles are incredibly applicable here to CDS Hooks best practices, things like targeting the right person, targeting the right time, targeting the right workflow. Okay, and that was all I had for best practices. I think maybe takeaways. Find that we've got Google, CDS Hooks best practices. The first top 2 results are relevant. That Confluence page is one of them. That has a kind of this full set of recommendations and best practices. And when right now we're looking for your feedback, if this is an area you have experience with, what are there practical, implementable lessons that are hard-won that you've learned that you can share with the broader community? I'm expecting we're going to package up these lessons learned and actually publish them on cds-hooks.org, I think, in the future as we continue to mature these over time. Okay, what questions do you have?
Thank you very much, Isaac. Now, there is the first question already from the audience.
Thank you, Isaac.
Sure.
Sorry, I didn't know if this was on. The one you talked about, silent mode, is that in the spec, how you turn that on or off?
No.
Or is that on your own?
I think that could be implemented pretty trivially from the CDS Hooks service perspective by simply never returning any cards.
Always empty,
empty
array. Okay. The other thing, trying to get everything done in the 500 milliseconds, has there ever been a thought of having like a deferred response where the server sends it, I'll get back to you later so that you don't, you know.
Yeah. And I think it depends on the clinical workflow, right? Like, so if a clinician is in the process of prescribing an order, getting back to you later is too late. I think there are times where, I think we've seen, as in the US, the coverage requirements discovery Da Vinci specification is kind of making reuse of CDS hooks for kind of a more administrative workflow, which is like, will this order be covered? Which can better support, kind of a deferred response or a later response. I think from the underlying, like, does that mean it should be an asynchronous HTTP exchange? I think that we haven't yet kind of ventured into the territory of like enabling async HTTP. However, kind of from a practical workflow perspective, sometimes that CRD, the administrative guidance is delivered in later workflows by the EHR or CPOE system. So we're gaining some experience there. I don't know if Bryn, if you want to add anything there. I think there are various kind of more advanced tips that are or tricks that are, strategies for maybe using order select and order sign together in the same workflow in order to kind of kick off like CDS service algorithm execution, and then to return, whereas that guidance is then being returned as part of like that second follow-up hook. So.
What was that thing called? Active something or other? The active messaging.
Smart web messaging. Yeah. And smart web messaging is pretty related to CDS hooks in that it kind of enables a similar functionality as when you have already launched a smart app, and a smart app is kind of embedded within. Within your EHR, and then it provides kind of an additional communication API path for local desktop level API traffic. Sometimes it can provide similar functionality, but that's a bit.
Do we maybe have one more question from the audience? If not, well, I do have one actually. You have mentioned the CDS hooks, they need to be fast, right? And mentioned the 500 milliseconds. But I was wondering, what about the clinical pathways that have multiple of the CDS hooks implemented? Does it sum up to 500 milliseconds then? Or is it per CDS hook called?
Yeah, very much per CDS hooks called. And the reason like that on the order of 500 milliseconds, like that level of speed is important, is because the clinician is kind of interacting with the UI, and you need to, and if we're going to display that clinical guidance to the clinician, it needs to be within their workflow, and their software needs to be reactive. I mean, I think there's even like important kind of academic research on like the degradation of user experience over the course of the first 8 seconds after you take some like UI action. You click a button, you can wait 2 seconds, and the software still works in your head, like from your perspective. If it takes 5 seconds, the software is no longer reliable, and if it takes 8 seconds, the software is completely broken. And so when as a CDS service has this now capability of injecting like UI, UX into clinical workflow experience, like now that CDS service also becomes responsible for ensuring that the software isn't broken from the clinician's experience. So, yeah, so per call.
Thank you
for the question.
Thank you very much, Isaac. A big final applause for him.
And thanks for giving me the opportunity.